Chapter 3 Into the Night. Kermorven heard Elof's tale out in silence. As king, he had the right, if he cared to use it, to judge any aspect of his followers' lives. As commander of the fleet, he had an equal right. Elof expected harsh words of condemnation when he had done, but Kermorven only looked at him with troubled gray eyes and asked, "What will you do now?" "What I sought to do first. Follow her. Find her. Make what amends I can. Aid her, if she is in need." Kermorven rose with a sigh, went to the railing, and looked out across the sea. Ilse shifted uneasily in her chair, her wide face lined with unhappiness. Then she rose, put a beaker of wine in Elof's hand, and her arm about his shoulder. Her cheek rested on his head a moment. "Yes, you were a fool," she muttered. "But who is not, when torn apart by love and worry?" She turned abruptly away. Rock, the only other hearer, was looking out to the sea also, avoiding his gaze. Elof gulped the wine, grateful on a throat made raw by seawater and long speaking. He had slept the day out in his exhaustion, and now the sun was setting behind the hills in furious flares of red and gold. Kermorven turned and watched its glorious decline. "The world is wide," he said darkly. Which way think you to start your search?" "The way she told me to, when first we parted," said Elof. "It was the way she flew last night." He gazed out across the open oceans into the darkening east. Thither, the path of the dawn. Rock turned his head. Ilse drew breath sharply. Kermorven nodded, as if he had expected that reply. "Across the trackless ocean that none has crossed these last 1,000 years. Once the ancient realm of Caris lay on its farther shore, home of our fathers. Who knows what lies there now?" Elof waited to be told he was mad, but Kermorven only remarked, "You will need ships. You may choose them from the fleet, and pick their crews." Elof stared and spluttered with surprise. "My lord, it would be... I have no right." "You have bought them many times over with your labor for me, even were there no stronger claims of friendship. Without yours I would have no throne. Now it is my turn to help you. I shall come with you." Elof stared up at the tall man, scarcely able to believe what he heard, and much humbled. To have this man's aid in his search. The years and experience of rule had deepened Kermorven's wisdom, without making him any the less fearsome a warrior. It was his firm hand, in peace and war, that had built up this whole kingdom from the ruins of 2 lands, raised it to peace and prosperity in less than a decade. It was his iron hand that held back the incoming raiders in the Westlands, that struck even up into the ruins of Norderney to free those imprisoned and enslaved. Against his command, year after year, the Equesh battered as if at an immovable wall, till it seemed that many grew weary of war for war's sake, and preferred to settle in what land they already had in peace. In that, as in many other ways, he thwarted the will of the ice, that fed and prospered upon the strife of men, and had made the Equesh its chiefest instrument. With a man at his side who could thus uphold a land, there were few roads he would not willingly tread. And that man was willing to leave all that he had built up, for no profit of his own. But behind all these thoughts, Elof had felt a growing unease. He glanced now at Rock and Ilse, and the alarm he saw on their faces brought it to a head. He rose, a little unsteadily still, and shook his head. My friend, I am more grateful than I can say, but I cannot allow it. You are the cornerstone of this land, of the lives of all men in it. How am I to draw that out on my own poor quest, and leave the rest without support? You have no deputy of stature, no heirs, no successors. Your place is here, and your duty. And I have selfish folly enough to live with. Kermorven nodded. So be it. It is an honorable answer, and I confess the one I had hoped for. Yet for my honor and my debt to you, the offer had to be made. You speak the truth, though I wish to the depths of my heart it were not so. I burn to help you, for your sake and Kara's, and I yearn still for the free adventure I once knew, and to see more of the world. He sighed again, and his voice took fire a moment, ere it sank to embers. To cross the sea of the sunrise, to gaze upon the fabled lands beyond, I could envy you that in a happier cause. But I am bound to stay, to go on with my labors and my worries. And I add to them the fate of a friend adrift in the unknown, without my aid. Well, said Ilse lightly, not quite. He'll at least have mine. Which just leaves me, rumbled Rock, irascible and offhand as ever. And yet his words were hollowed out by deep disquiet. Can't be sitting around here getting bored while you two go gallivanting. But Elof could not let them finish. The same for you as for the king, my lady, if not more. For his folk follow him all, and willingly. You must win the trust of yours, for the East, and for men. And if you cannot, who can? No, princess of the elder folk, you also are bound. And you, rounding on Rock, what of your bonds? I'll not ruin your life for the faint chance of mending mine. Marja bade you farewell for a summer only. What of her, if you do not return? Rock shrugged, seeming very uneasy, and turned away once more. I can't say, he said between his teeth, but I should still come, damn you. Elof shook his head. No more, any of you. We have seen too much together to say more, I think. I should wind no other in the webs of my own folly. No friends, no crews. I would not weaken the fleet. I'll make my own way back to Morvenhall. Find a boat there. Kermorven dismissed the idea with a curt wave. None fit to cross the wide oceans in. All such we have with us. If there were others, I would have brought them. Take one, at least. Do not burden me with so great a debt. There was genuine pleading in his cold eyes, though he added crisply, and do not martyr yourself in foolish penitence. If you have a purpose, carry it through with sense. If you would help her, do it properly. Elof drew a deep breath. I will take a boat, but only one I can handle by myself. One of the cutters, then, though they are barely large enough for your need, and hard for one to handle. But we have nothing better, unless... Here. He rose, and striding to the stern post, he unlatched the heavy wind vane and tossed it to Elof. I return you this, with thanks. We have fared well enough in the past without it, and it may make all the difference to you. When do you wish to leave? Elof looked at the dimming sky. At once, I fear. As soon as there is a wind, the land breeze after dark, perhaps. But first, I must go back and find those damnable anklets. I let them fall in my panic. They could still be perilous. I will destroy them as soon as I have the chance. But it must be done with care to release what is within. Unless... He paused a moment, reflecting. Unless they might be of some help. But first I must secure them. By your leave? Go then, said Kermorvan sadly. I will give the orders for the best cutter to be provisioned and made ready. It should not take long. It was now early dusk, the sky gray clouded save where the sun glowed still through great streaks and slashes, like rich garb showing through a beggar's cloak. That made Elof's search all the harder. The campfires were not yet lit, and he had not thought to take a lantern ashore. Over root and through thicket he stumbled, cursing the dimness, unsure even quite where they had stood those few hours since, she and he. But the last thin gleam of the sun awoke an answer among a tuft of long grass well down the beach, and there he found first one anklet, then the other, already half buried in the dry sand. He must have hurled them from him in those blind moments. He could not remember. He loathed the sight of them now, scooped them up as if they were poisonous snakes, but forced himself to blow the sand from them and stow them carefully away. He straightened up, dusting his hands, and glanced out across the waters. The lanterns were being lit aboard the Prince Corentin, and the other ships were following suit. By their light he made out a lesser, light-hulled shape in the lee of the flagship's bulk, with many figures busy about its deck. That was in hand, then. No more now remained to be done, save to bid farewell to his friends, his home, all he had worked for these last 9 years, and before, all he had grown to love. But the shaping was his own. He had no right to complain. He turned, stumbled back in sheer alarm, lost his footing, and sprawled amid the dewy grass. So close behind him the figure stood. Tall it seemed, and more than tall, a column of darkness against the dark, the immense figure of a man all muffled up in a black cloak. Only at the edges of him did the shiplights find a gleam. Upon the curve of the great shield at his back, the shadowy visor of the helm beneath the hood, the long black spear balanced in his black gauntleted hand. Beneath the visor, a pale-skinned face caught the light, a great eagle nose and bushy gray-black beard around lips hard and unsmiling. His breath smoked in the evening chill. "Oh, no," breathed Elof, raising himself on one elbow. "Oh, no, no!" The hood moved. The tall man was looking him up and down. "Where to at such an hour, and in such haste?" Elof swallowed. He knew the voice, deep and stern. "To seek out a thing I have lost," he said, scrambling up. "How should it concern you?" The man appeared to be considering. "If you have lost it," he remarked, "how do you know which way to search?" "By my own eyes," barked Elof impatiently, and then plaintively. "Why would you hinder me? What harm can—" He stopped. The figure had held up its empty hand. "Suppose another has it. What then? How will you take it back?" Sudden anger swelled in Elof, and putting hand to belt, he swept the sword Gorthar snarling from the scabbard, and it gleamed as black as any of the other's armor. "With this, if need there be." The hood bent down over the leveled blade. "A mighty weapon," Yet there are mightier, and the finest sword is no stronger than the arm behind it. Who made it, I wonder? Elof reined in his patience as best he could. Great aid and great danger hovered over him here, and he could not guess which. How would I know? It came to me from the hand of one long dead. The hood turned slowly from side to side. You do not speak the truth. No hand save yours has ever held this blade. Elof's control snapped. Do you name me liar, or mock me with riddles? One truth I'll tell you, that if you think to delay me here, bandying idle words, then power though you may be, you're sorely mistaken. If you can aid me, do so without tormenting me, and if not, leave me to go my own way for once. The hood rose to its full height. That you have done. And to what end? If you address a power, should you not show some respect instead of tempting its wrath? Respect? Blazed Elof with a bitter laugh. Now truly you mock. What have I seen of the powers? What have they been to me save trial and torture? Help, said the deep voice quietly, and love. Elof felt the veins throb at his temples. Help? From you? Did I not hear you yourself say it, that it was only to balance another power's meddling? Better far to have had neither. And love? That was the worst torture of all. And though mine was the fault, yet I was sorely driven to it. Leave me to work out my own destiny. Why have you come to plague me now? If you'll not aid me, then let me pass. The hood was thrown back. The helm shone clear against the clouds, its eyes dark shadows, unfathomed. I came to tell you this. What you did is done. Leave it, lest worse befall. More rests on it than you can ever know. Elof shook like a wind-blown aspen. Leave it. Leave Kara? Never see her more? Leave her. Wait, and be content. A great change is coming. Upon a vast brink, the whole world trembles. Even to the powers, its end is not revealed. Be not too eager to leap into the balance, till you know which way it must tilt. I know this, that Kara may need me, that I must find her, free her if need be, were I never to see her more, and that I will seek her thither, in the sunrise, whatever you place in my path. The voice grew cold, harsh, daunting in its power. The way you would seek her, you must not go. The huge spear swung in his hand, barring Elof's path to the shore. In a single movement, Elof drew his armored gauntlet from his belt and thrust his left hand within. And who are you to forbid me? I've broken the will of powers ere now. Beware lest I sweep you also from my path. He raised his hands. In his left palm the crystal glittered, ready to drink in whatever was hurled at him. And in his right, Gorthar, poised to strike in its turn. Wield your spear. but weigh well the craft in my hands." He took a swift pace forward and brought Gorthar against the dark haft of the spear, between the massive hands that held it. The tall figure did not move. With gritted teeth, feeling a sudden sweat break out on his brow, Elof drew the black blade's edge lightly across the shining surface of the haft, and saw a faint score appear there, finer than a hair. Then he sprang back, almost dropping the blade. The figure had not moved, but across the sky behind it there leaped great fronds of searing white that seemed to join and meet behind the crest of the helm like the crown of a blasting force. In its light, the right eye hole of the visor shone ghastly white. The socket beneath was eyeless, empty, blind as bone. A moment later the sound reached him, a somber crackle and crash as if high above the cloud roof a vast door slammed closed. A cold breeze blew in his face, and great raindrops began to fall, like tears. The tall man stepped forward, lifted a hand, and Elof scuttled back, weapons at the ready. But there was no move to attack. He was simply pulling up his hood. Again he looked at Elof, and when he spoke, the voice was heavy with many things: weariness, contempt, sorrow, and perhaps also pity. "Go on, then. I cannot prevent you." He strode past Elof into the shadow of the bushes and was gone. Elof stood gazing after him, his jaw sagging, his head in a fearful whirl. The flare of his anger had passed, and a great uncertainty was upon him. What had he done? What should he have done? What could he? Not abandon Kara. Of that alone he was sure. His lips pressed tight at the thought. And yet till now the raven had always aided him, however harrowing that aid might be. And he too had spoken of a great change impending. The powers seemed to sense it, yet they could not foresee what it might be. He thought then of the tremors of the earth that at times shook Kerbrahine, and of how it was said that animals, both wild and tame, sensed them hours before they came, heard perhaps the stirring of the earth fires upon which the hard rock floated. Then, it was said, they grew uneasy, chafed at restraints, and fled. But a thing of this magnitude? Whence could any flee? Save beyond the circles of the world, perhaps, which for men meant only the river. "I have no choice," he said aloud to the surrounding darkness, and liked little the tone of helpless complaint in his voice. "I must go. I must follow." Slowly he turned and walked towards the shore. At his back the fires sprang to life, but from their warmth and light he turned away. When he clambered back up to the flagship's deck, he found his friends awaiting him. "A storm brews," began Kermorven. "Would you not be better to put off?" Elof shook his head. "It only comes on a land wind," he answered, "and it cannot be bad. I heard only the one thunderclap. It will serve to speed me on my way." Of its true cause he said nothing, and strove to conceal that he knew. Kermorven revered the powers, and Raven most of all. Such a warning he might heed, and feel it a king's duty to enforce it. "Is my boat made ready?" "It is," said Kermorven, and sorrow weighed his words. "The cutter Morden awaits you overside. That is Seafire in the northern tongue. Your gear is aboard, and supplies in plenty, though how long your voyage must be, We cannot tell. We have no charts that can help you, and no records. None have sailed east these last 1,000 years or more. The last to sail westward was your great forebear, Vade, and he left no account. Sun and stars must keep you on your course, and may they be favorable to you. His face was as Elof had seen it in their worst adversity, set like flint. We would stay you longer if we could, but our debt to you will not allow that. You leave our land bereft of your skill and power. You leave me bereft of my chiefest friend. Do you return one day if you can, whatever your case or condition. Then we shall rejoice. May your quest's ending be a happy one. Speeches, spat out Ilse, and seizing Elof, she embraced him so hard he feared his ribs would crack, and buried her face a moment in his shoulder. Now get on with you. Elof did his best to nod and smile, but he could say nothing. The crew were flocking around him, extending hands to him, slapping him on the back, calling out their good wishes. It was goodwill he felt he did not deserve, and it came near to breaking his heart. By the ladder, Rock awaited him, with no more than a nod and a slap on the shoulder. Elof was grateful for that. Down you go, and when you give the word, I'll cast you off at the bows, he said. Elof nodded and hurried down the rope ladder. His feet thumped onto the cutter's polished deck. It was less resonant than usual, and closer to the water. So great was the weight of supplies below. He hurried to hoist the headsail. It would pull his bows free of the flagship. He kept his head lowered so those on the deck would not see how close he was to weeping. The headsail caught the breeze and billowed out. He ran astern to set it with the winches, and slipped the stern mooring. All right, Rock, he cried then. Cast off forward. The headsail filled, the cutter began to move, and to a chorus of farewells he leaned on the tiller and turned her nose out from under the curve of the Correnton's timbered flank. Around her bows he swung, heading out into the wide estuary of Encarvidoen. But as the cutter's bows crossed the pool of light from the flagship's lanterns, he had to turn and look back. Ilse stood by the rail, gripping it in her plump fingers, and he cursed himself that he had said no word to her. He raised a hand to touch his heart, and she nodded quickly and turned away. But high upon the carven bows Kermorven stood, tall and pale and grim as winter, his arm raised in solemn salute. Elof rose quickly and lifted his hand in return. It is said that they seemed for a moment like the statues that stood upon Morvenhall's seawall, of an earlier Karen and the grim old Lord Vade who was his friend. For in that time many years seemed to fall upon Elof, and score his face deeply. But all too soon the vision passed. Out into the night the small craft glided, became a ghostly glimmer upon blackness, and faded then altogether from Correnton's sight. Though they could not see him, Elof could still see them, the great ship in its glowing circle and the fleet beyond. He stood there a long while watching. He had made many farewells in his life, but surely none more bitter than this. His thoughts moved like the craft beneath him, upon blackness. Only the thrash and creak of the boom called him to himself. It was high time and past to hoist the mainsail. He turned the sea fire into the wind, set the tiller, and clambered up to free the lashings. One was stiff. He tugged at it and swore. Then he started so violently he all but went over the rail. Out of the darkness another hand had reached, and twitched the other strand of the knot free. Thought you were supposed to be the sailor, jibed Rock. What in the jaws of hell? Elof shouted, and then he gathered his wits. You sprang on board once you'd cast off, I suppose. Right. You can help me with the mainsail, but the moment it's done, keep your head down. We're going about. Back to the Quarantine. Think so, do you? Inquired Rock with an ominous calm as they struggled to free the heavy gaff from the boom and begin unfurling the sail. And why might that be, may I ask? Why? Snorted Elof. Didn't I tell you to your face once already? You can't just cast off all your obligations like that, public or personal. You're needed back home, man, needed. Oh, am I? Elof, checking the hanks around the mast, paused and looked up. Marja needs you. And you've a place in the state. Oh, as what? Not a bloody smith. I'll tell you that. Hammering bits of iron? Aye. Without this messing about with virtue's chance, I'm fine at that. I did all right in Bryhane. They lost the true craft there. But here? There's a smith's guild here, with flaming master smiths and all. And there's you. Whenever folk look at me, they see you. Behind me like a shadow. Only the shadow's the brighter. Just think. Here's one with no true craft. How'd he ever get to be a smith? And here's the other, and he's got craft enough for two. Hella, but it's been hard. And now my woman's a master smith? What you need me for? Contrast? Can't even talk about her work with me. Haven't a bloody clue what she's on about. And her work's her life. So we don't talk. Haven't for a while now. And precious little else either. Different in the Southlands. I was a rich one there. The one they looked up to. Who looks up to me here? He turned, spat into the wind, and swore at the result. I'm sorry, Rock, said Elof quietly. I had wondered. I should have realized. I can't tear you away from our other friends. There's much good you could do in the king's service. Why do you think he's been making this much use of me? He knows. Not much he doesn't notice, our long friend. So he's been sending me on all these weighty errands. Well, then. Elof freed the main halyard and passed him the end. Wind it around the winch there. Carefully. People will come to respect you for that, soon enough. King's trusted emissary. There's many a role of less honor to play. Now wind when I say, yes, that way. Rock chuckled. Indeed, that's so. It's a role I play now. Elof, who had been about to give the command, stopped and stared. You mean he knows you're here? He sent you? By royal warrant, aye. Read it if you like. Got it in my hip pocket somewhere. Charged to return to him, intact if at all possible, the person of his right worthy and well-trusted court smith. Well, you know the form. Said he wouldn't sleep easy with you milling around the whale roads on your own. And, well, I jumped at the commission, didn't I? Elof shook his head feebly. But you can't. This is folly. This voyage. For any other, I mean. Ah, well, don't go smothering me with gratitude, will you? A sudden gust buffeted the cutter, plucked at the unfurled edge of sails. The gaff swung violently, caught Elof in the chest and stretched him flat on the deck. "Hell's black belly, man," roared Rock, trying to restrain the threshing spar. "Will you lay off flapping your lip and sail this thing? You want us wrecked not 10 minutes out at sea?" "We're not at sea yet," wheezed Elof. "Still in the estuary. You hate the sea, Rock." "I'll not like it the better for being dumped in it." "The winch, then. Not too fast." "That's right." Smoothly, the heavy gaff rose to its proper inclination and creaked its way up the mast, the stiff sail creaking and flapping like a vast dry wing in the quickening wind. Elof kept a careful hand on the main sheet winch till the gaff hung tight at the top of the mast, then showed Rock how to fasten the halyards securely, and turned to the tiller. "Now back here with me, out of the way of the boom. Take the main sheet here. Pay it out little by little as I tell you." Rock looked askance at him. "Fine old time you'll have, doing all this on your own." Elof, too preoccupied to understand, set hand to the tiller and swung the sea fire about. In a thunder of sailcloth, the boom scythed across the deck, thudded up short as the main sheet restrained it. At Elof's word, Rock unwound the winch. The mainsail caught the wind and grew full with it. The sea fire, spurred like a spirited horse, sprang forward over the white-capped windrows. The headsail sang and strained at the sheets, dangerously tight. Elof thrust the tiller at Rock and sprang for the winch. Swiftly he slackened the headsail, let out the mainsheet a little, then very carefully he eased the tension on the winches with the heel of his hand. He saw there was little or no flutter at the luff edges of the sails, against mast and forestay, and glanced at the trailing hempen strands sewn in rows across the sailcloth. The rows fluttered at a slight angle to each other. Sails not quite set, then. But if he... Then another consideration slashed across the rest. "Well?" came Rock's sardonic inquiry. "If you're wanting rid of me, hadn't we best be turning tail now? Or won't you have a long tack back?" Elof bit his lip. "You're right." "What do I do? Swing the tiller?" "No! I didn't mean that anyway. I meant what you said earlier. I can sail the cutter on my own. Just. And in easy conditions. How I'd fare in a storm?" Said Rock dubiously. "In a storm, you might be on your own." "You'll get used to it soon enough." "Whatever you say," sighed Rock. But he did not sound convinced. Unhappy as he was, Elof summoned up a grin. "You could still change your mind." "No?" He chuckled. "Rock, I'm glad. I've got to admit it. But it's a mad venture all the same. Scarce a hope of returning, let alone succeeding." Rock snorted. "Think I need you to tell me that? But then, when the whole world's daft, maybe it's as well to be dafter yet." Elof nodded wryly, and from that time he argued no more, but took in the mainsail a little further and pulled the tiller gently towards him. The cutter heeled slightly as it bore away, and the slap of the wavelets beneath the hull quickened like a pulse. Before the land wind and the oncoming storm that rode it, the sea fire ran upon a broad reach, away through the dark roads of Ancarvadoin and out until the horns of the bay dwindled to strips of shadow upon either flank, and their bows reared and plunged upon the higher swell of the open ocean beyond, unsheltered and unforgiving. Thus it was, as the chronicles record, that the two friends set forth on a quest that was to prove darker, more perilous, and more painful than any in their lives before, and of greater moment. For in the end it was to cast them, as the raven had foretold, into the very balance of the changing world. How long their voyage endured, no account is certain. It may be that no exact record survived. Upon the open sea, with nothing above but clouds, constant only in their inconsistency, it might indeed have been easy to lose track of the hours, the days that passed by, forever alone at the focus of a vast arena of empty water. Yet it is unlikely that they did so, for they were not aimless wanderers, but steering a course by sun and stars. Elof at least had studied the simple principles of navigation, as were then understood with the master-smith, that he might learn to make the necessary instruments. In later years, as friend to such a mariner as Kermorvan, he had learned more, and much sea lore besides. Yet it is said only that for many weeks they sailed swiftly and well, and that the sea fire bore them safely through many a time of peril. In that first storm that hunted them from the land there was hard going, for as it came upon them the rudder fought like a living thing, Rock and Elof struggling desperately to lash it down, while the wind yelled in their ears. Fresh rain drummed upon their heads, and heavy seas broke every minute over the stern. Long hours the weather lasted, and they were left sodden, exhausted, bruised, and sore from the tossing about they had received. Their hair was rimed with salt that stiffened their garments and flayed the skin from them as cruelly as the ropes that hissed and ran through their fingers. But the cutter was a finely made craft, and though it rode low in the water under its weight of supplies, the sea washed harmlessly across its well-caulked decking and slopped out through the scuppers. It scudded on before the storm, bounding impudently across the wave crests, and when at the end of the night the clouds broke and the risen sun beamed down on them once more, they saw mast and rig as firm as ever, and the bilges scarce wetter than before. No line had parted, nor any seam loosened, and Elof smiled at that, for in the shipyards he himself had laid such virtues of strength upon the metal fastenings. Even Rock, though he groaned and grumbled as loudly as the waves that ran still high beneath the hull, was impressed, and more confident that they might somehow come through the voyage alive. Elof had always wondered at the daring of the hero Vade in braving this same passage in what was, by all accounts, no larger a craft, a feat that many ascribed to necromancy. He found reason to doubt that in the weeks that followed. The sudden squalls he had come to fear around the coasts he could ride out easily here, and worse weather also. For though the storms of the ocean were terrible, when the chill airs came blasting down off the ice to whip the waves into white-capped peaks that loomed high above the Seafire's masthead, and between them sudden sickening troughs that swallowed it up, yet at least there were no lee shores at hand to worry about, no rocks or shoals lurking, hungry to rake the belly from the boat like a dagger-tooth its prey. And down into trough and up over peak the little cutter rode, where sleek longships or massive dromond might have been caught across the crests and twisted apart, or plunged in bow or stern and been overturned in the troughs. He could climb the rising slopes of waves that would have burst like falling mountains upon the decks of larger craft, sweeping off rig and crew alike, and tumbling toy-like the mastless hulk that remained. Like a gull, it floated upon the heaving hills of ocean, lurching madly this way and that. Often no sail could be carried. The rudder had to be lashed, and a sea anchor thrown out to keep the drifting bows into the wind. Yet though sorely soaked and battered, it came through whole, its crew with it. Yet though sorely soaked and Elof came to conclude that in refusing Kermorvan's ships, he had all unconsciously made the wiser choice. Those weeks at sea were by no means all storms. It was spring, and though that brought gales and rain in plenty, they carried warm weather in their wake. There were cool, crisp nights when the stars shone among ragged clouds like gems beneath gray velvet, and their wake came alight with the phosphorescence the ship was named for, a shimmering stream of cool fire like the reflection of some invisible moon. There were fair days, when the foam crests were dazzling in the clear light, when the expanse of seas shone like a vast disk of sapphire under a cloudless sky. At times, the sunbeams slanted down into the deeps, picking out shoals of fish, ranging from tiny things glittering like glass shards that swept this way and that in clouds of light, to bulky, barb-finned things as long as a man, their flattened flanks gleaming iridescent as they glided effortlessly past the speeding ship. Mostly the men marveled, but from time to time Rock would lower a line among the speeding mass, and the formation would dissolve into a threshing tangle of jaws as ready to snap at hooks unbaited as baited. It often took the two of them a long struggle to hoist up the catch, and many of the huge fish flipped themselves free against the ship's flanks. Often a school of porpoises would come to leap and sport like merry children around the bow, mocking its man-made sleekness with their speed and grace. For Elof and for Rock, they could never come often enough, nor stay too long. But they soon grew bored with the unresponsive ship and sped off. More than once their greater cousins came to alarm. Immense whales rising singly or in vast schools that appeared in a line of white water mist-crowned along the horizon, like breakers upon some vast and impassable shoals. Remembering the hounds of Nairad, Elof steered well clear of them, feeling like a mouse among the tall cattle he had once herded, and for the most part they left the sea fire equally alone. Not all such encounters were as harmless. Very early on they grew used to sharks circling the cutter, and after an alarming experience of rocks, they were careful never to trail hands in the water. The beasts came in all sizes, but even a small one was well able to remove a finger. Some were vast and solitary monsters, far longer than the cutter, but apparently harmless, idling by the sea fire with enormous mouths hanging witlessly agape. Though I have heard of others as large that live in deep waters and hunt like their lesser cousins, Elof remarked. The headman in Assenby kept a tooth of one. And, prompted Rock nervously. Bigger than my two hands, Elof said tersely. You could drive a cart through such jaws as held it. Do you try if you like. How'd you tell 'em from these peaceable brutes? Elof shrugged. Go for a swim around one. Rock shuddered. Needless to say, he never took Elof up on his suggestion, and Elof himself came to regret making it, for it brought home to him very uncomfortably, when he had already had time to grow used to the sea and consider himself a hardened hand, just how vast a deep there lay beneath these fragile boards, where light and warmth gave swift way to blackness unending and chill. What secrets might not such depths contain? Yet it was not from any depths that their next hazard was to come. In all their voyage till that day, they had seen no other craft, and that was no surprise to Elof. So when one clear morning in the 6th week of their voyage, he heard Rock's hail, he came running up from the little cabin at once. A sail? It can't be. Where? Brock simply shrugged and pointed northward into the wind. Then Elof saw it at once, a high triangle of whiteness just rising above the horizon that might indeed have been some great sails gleaming fair and clean in the sunlight, spread wide to run before the stiff breeze. But when they had watched it in silence for some minutes, Elof shook his head doubtfully. He strode forward to the mast, scrambled up it as far as he dared with the ship thus heeling on a beam reach, and shading his eyes, strained to make out what lay below the horizon. Rock, seeing him start, called up, "What manner of hull has it, then?" "No hull," was Elof's curt reply, and he came sliding down to the deck and ran to the helm. "No hull, because it isn't a ship, and that whiteness is no sail. It rises sheer from the water." "Hell's blue teeth. What is it then, man?" "Something I should have known sooner. I saw enough of them in my childhood home, come the fall. When the ice islands came drifting southward, then it was time to beach all the larger fisher craft of the village, and only the little skin boats would go out, buoyed with blown-up skins. "Ice islands," echoed Rock uneasily. "Aye, great drifting chunks of it, fallen from the greater mass to the north, no doubt. Some are very hills and towers afloat. I thought them evil things even before I learned what lay behind the ice. But they were harbingers of winter, then, and melted away with the spring. I would never have looked to see one this far south, and in this season." "Might be a stray," suggested Rock. "A leftover from this winter past, slow to melt." Elof nodded. "It might. Though if that is melting, what size was it at first? And where one strays, so might a flock. We would do well to watch for more. At least we will be able to outrun them, if the wind holds from the north." And hold it did, for so long, so steadily, and so chill, that Elof came to conclude it must be blowing straight down across the ice from its northernmost heart in the frozen oceans at the summit of the world, where no man might pass. That, too, seemed strange in late spring. What little weather lore there was of the open ocean predicted cool easterlies off the ice at this season, and some milder westerlies further south. But the cold blast southward reigned, and though it might falter at times, it seldom gave way to any other wind for long, a day at most. They began to think of it as the only thing constant upon the changing ocean, and on its back, as they were soon to find, it bore many ice islands more. On that first day, they only appeared to northward, but on the following afternoon, a great jagged band of white lifted against the leaden sky almost in their path. It was no danger to them, being easy enough to avoid in the wide ocean, though to do so meant a series of long and annoying tacks. They glared at it as it glided by them, its flanks glistening against the dull clouds, scoured into strange, bluish ridges by sun and sea, slick now with meltwater like the slime of some unclean beast. In the few days of peace that followed, Elof steered to the southeast as far as he dared, to avoid more ice. The sailing was all too easy, bearing away effortlessly before that southward wind when it blew, or running comfortably on the weaker westerlies. In these latitudes the air was milder, and while there was some heavy weather, even the water that came roaring over the bows seemed warmer, or at least less chill. Rock reveled in the change, but Elof distrusted it. Fearful of straying into the sudden calms for which southern waters were notorious, he kept watch on their position and progress, and thus it was that they were not taken by surprise. For it was as he attempted to trace the sun one overcast noontide, by a subtle instrument with thin sheets of spar crystal, that he noticed the dark speck cresting the southward horizon. Against the sullen sky, shaded in charcoal and lead, they might otherwise have quite missed their peril till it was too late. But now it was his turn to hail, and Rocks to come running in disbelief. When he saw, though, he whistled, long and low. "Well, a sail it is surely this time, and a big un. Now what?" He stopped then, and swallowed audibly. Elof nodded. His own mouth had gone suddenly dry. Black, yes. "But not here," burst out Rock in violent disbelief. "They've no way onto this ocean." "I know," muttered Elof. Memories arose at the sight, old and bloody. And yet, he stared suddenly. The black speck was distorting, shivering, settling into a new shape. They're going onto a new tack, and I'll give you one guess why. Rock nodded grimly. "They've spotted us. Want to hang around and see who they are?" "No, indeed," grated Elof. "Ready on the winches. If I bring her closer to the wind, we should be able to keep our distance long enough to lose them, whoever they may be." He unlatched the tiller and bore down on it. The nose swung around from southeast to due east once more, and the sea fire heeled as Rock wound in the headsail, riding in the strong northerly like a spirited steed. It was the first time he had been wholly thankful for that wind. As they began to pick up speed and skip and slice along the wave crests, he saw the black sail seem to slip away beneath the horizon once again. He smiled with cold satisfaction. But then Rock seized him by the sleeve and pointed, and what he saw dashed that smile from his lips. Over the brink of the waters ahead, 2 more dark peaks arose and grew with startling speed. Their square sails angled the sail close to the wind. They were hurtling down on him as fast as he toward them. Another minute, while he hesitated, looked wildly about, and their bows lifted into view, high-arched, knife-edged, and cruel, black as the sails save for the white beast patterns they bore. "Eckwesh they are," cried Rock. "Turn back, go about, or within the hour they'll have us." Elof felt a sear of bitter cold in head and stomach. "They're too close. They'll have us anyway if we turn. There's only one way now. Ready on those winches. I'll take her on as close a reach as I dare." "Close to the wind?" yelled Rock. "You mean northward again, among the ice islands?" "Northward indeed," barked Elof, "and right up to the ice itself if need be." "Are you gone stark mad?" "Think, man. They're 4 times our size. And what rig have they but one square sail? On the open ocean they can run us down. But among the narrow ice roads? Now stand to that winch, and haul, man, haul!" Rock shook his head, but he flung himself on the winches and wound with all his strength, while Elof leaned hard on the heavy tiller and felt the sea fire begin to shift beneath him, take the waves from a different angle. Her bows dipped, and great wings of spray burst over the bows before he had her properly trimmed, flying shards of water that stung his face as if already hardened into ice. They were on a northeasterly heading now, sailing toward the wind on a close reach, good and fast. The chill of the northerly played across him like a hoary breath, and he clutched his jacket close about him. An inner chill was on him that no warmth could cure, save one, and from her now he felt as far as ever he had been. Perhaps Rock sensed this, for he began to bustle about below, and soon reappeared bearing mugs of their precious ale, cakes of hard bread, and deep bowls of stewed smoke meat. "There, get this down you while you can. Times like this you never know when your next meal's likely to be. And the longer the stove's quenched, the better, till our little friends are well out of the way," he snorted. "Speaking of which, how in the iciest parts of hell did they ever get into it? They were stuck the whole breadth of the land away." "Yet they took Morvanik that was," Elof reminded him. "Aye, by marching a few thousand fanatics half to death across the ice. You telling me they hauled a warship on their shoulders? Anyway, we cleaned out every last man-eater of that pack." "That we knew of? They had a year. They might have built one, and a few survivors fled in it. But where have they been since?" Elof clawed a hand through his dark hair in frustration. You're right. It makes no sense. But look south, and there are—" "True," uttered Rock. "And so's the ice. Look you north, and here we are, rushing like loons between them. And what sense do you find in that?" Thus they ran, through many long days and nights, and thus they were pursued. It was a time of terrible strain for them both, for the ice islands arose in their path once more, monstrous jagged things that gleamed in daylight like the fangs of harsh mountains, and under moon and stars glimmered like fragments of a sickly dream. Elof feared a night of overcast and storm, when they could only heave to and await what the waves would send them, ice or Ekwesh. But the skies grew clearer the further north they went, and the hours of darkness shorter. None the less, they slept little and poorly, for neither could linger away from the deck. Rock could not handle the cutter on his own for long in the best of conditions, and in any difficulty, Elof needed him. All this, while the enemies at their heels were well crewed and tireless. Whenever Elof could, he studied them at their maneuvering, saw how they twisted and turned their loose, heavy sails to tack around the ice islands he passed. Clumsy he found them, but skilled and swift, and in their pursuit inexorable. It was small wonder that at each dawning the black sails loomed that trace larger, that fraction nearer. They were growing bitterly chill, these dawnings, and the rime upon the rigging was slower to disperse in the sun. The ice islands were more frequent now, appearing on every quarter, and the sea between them was no longer clear, but filling gradually with smaller floes and drifting chunks still large enough to stave in a small craft's planking or to spring its seams. Elof steered with minute care, and gritted his teeth at every scrape or rumble upon the hull. At nights, he had to take care lest the sail grew too heavily coated with ice, whose weight might easily capsize them. In such seas, that would be death too swift for even their pursuers to pick them up. And one clear night, when the ocean seemed like a shattered dish of white under the full moon, he saw a dread sight rise up above its crazed rim. a mist of white like the starry river overhead, but lying all across the northern horizon. As a boy, he had seen it first. As a man on the verge of a new life, he had watched it fade behind him. What was he, now that he faced the ice globe once again? Almost like a ghost he felt, a troubled spirit wandering uneasily in a body that galled it, yet dared not be cast off. He huddled deeper into his fur-lined cloak and yearned for sunrise. But when it came, they found themselves plunging on a freshening wind toward a sea that seemed almost solid, with drifting islands and floes of white, and ended in a high wall of white that arose in the farthest distance, a strength and rampart that stretched all across the northern horizon, and on either hand vanished with it into the blur of distance, beneath the curve of the world. And as they looked, they felt that cold, constant blast strike full in their faces, pouring down those frozen heights like an invisible fosse, washing their ancient malice out across the oceans of the world. "The walls of winter," said Elof darkly, "cliffs and fortresses of the ice. But at least it grows thick enough in those waters. There, we may manage to evade our hunters." "Or cheat them of their prey," grunted Rock, hopping from one foot to another and flexing numbed fingers to keep the blood flowing. "Can't eat meat that's 50 fathoms down and frozen solid, can they?" Elof laughed. "That's true enough." He glanced back once with weary eyes at the sails that flocked like storm clouds behind them, then rubbed his hands and took firm grip on the tiller. "Well, to your place and stand ready. The most perilous course we can steer. That's where our hopes lie now." And with iron care he edged the tiller around, swinging closer and closer to the northward, trying to watch both the streamers and the vein, and the channels that opened between the wallowing ice pack. One whit too close, and it happened. Elof saw the dark speck from the corner of his eye just as Rock shouted in sudden alarm. He could not help being distracted, looking around. Kermorven might have carried it off, but Elof was not half the seaman he was. His hand jerked on the tiller and edged the sea fire too far into the wind. In the smaller boats he was used to sailing, it might have mattered less, but the cutter was 4 times their size, and undermanned. He lost control. Rock yelled and ducked as the sails emptied overhead and the boom flailed loose across the deck, the gaff threshing this way and that against sheet and stay, raining flakes of ice down upon the deck. The tiller kicked. Elof lost his hold and fell sprawling. Their speed slackened, altered, and the sea fire wallowed uncontrolled, left for vital moments to the mercy of the waves and the keen-edged floes around. Dodging the wild swing of the tiller, Elof scrambled up. He knew only too well that the two of them could not regain control quickly enough to swing her away from the wind again. If they lost so much of their start, it would only be a matter of time before they were overhauled, or driven against the ice and sunk. Without the wind, it was almost before thought that he had sprung to the sternpost, seized the rimed metal that hung there, gripped it, pushed it. It quivered, but it did not move. Like holding a door against a gale, Kermorven had described it. But he had striven only with a brisk breeze in a sheltered harbor. Now it felt as if Elof strove with the naked force of the gale itself, all flowing through the very metal, or sought to dam a torrent with his fingers. And worse, He seemed to sense some other guiding force behind it, as if other hands pressed or pulled at the vane's far side, constantly opposing his own. He was losing his grip. His chest ached. His breath whistled between his clenched teeth. His fingers slipped over the incised pattern, the spray-encrusted salt crackling beneath them in its serpentine. But he felt something else there also. Darkness swirled before his mind's eye, depths green and gloomy through which he sank, drifting down, and something was rising to meet him. A sudden, smothering fear gripped him, and it unleashed new strength. Crying out aloud, he thrust violently against the vane, and felt it give a little, swing, then stick, immovable. It was enough. Hanging there exhausted, he saw the streamers leap up straight and shivering, heard the stays thrum and quiver. The lashing boom suddenly jerked out straight as the sail filled with a crack like a whip of the powers, and the cutter surged forward once again, heeling wildly. Elof grabbed the tiller. Rock, crawling to a winch, gave a whoop of delight and pointed astern. The same slight shift in the wind that had filled their sails had spilled it from the black square sails astern, leaving them wallowing as helpless as the cutter had been. "And see how soon you get out of that, my fine man-eaters!" yelled Rock, shaking his fist at them. But Elof caught him by the shoulders and gestured. The wind had shifted a little to the east, and they were sailing on a close-reach northeastward now, and ahead of them was the black speck that had startled them. Clearly now another Equesh sail. It had been tacking well wide of the ice, but already they could see the sail begin to shift. The momentary collapse and sudden billowing tautness that meant it was sweeping down the wind to intercept them. "How many of the bastards are there?" howled Rock, brushing his red fringe out of his eyes. "Is it a whole fleet they've got on our tail?" "They must have been searching," reasoned Elof absently, measuring his distances from the newcomer. "Or on guard, quartering the seas, beating about, each ship to a sector, or they would have come on us together. Now they flock. And perhaps this one was astern of the rest, and they signaled it to sail north to cut us off. Their shamans have such arts." He bit his lip and felt it numb as wood. "He is near us now, that one, and fast upon us. It will be a close run, Rock, within bowshot even. You might want to don your armor." "No, thanks. Sooner not face a swim in that if it's all the same to you. And metal's bloody cold. But bowshot, now that can work both ways, can't it?" He turned and ducked quickly through the companionway, and reappeared with 2 bundles of arrows and 2 large bows. The arrows he thrust into racks by the tiller, and set about stringing the bows. "Not the best shots, you and I, are we? Wish we'd Kermorvan here, or old Gaius even. What's he about now, do you think? But we'll maybe pink their arses for them. If only these thrice-damned strings. Ah, there. Now yours. How long have we, think you?" Elof had been asking himself the same question. "Less than an hour. The horizon's a bare league distant, and they're coming in fast. Shoot if you wish, but stand ready on the winches. We cannot fight a whole warcraft. what hope we have lies in flight. It was not long indeed before they saw the Equus ship more clearly. Long and narrow in the hull, but high of side and decked. It was much the same as that one Elof had helped to capture, one wild foggy night many years since. Now, though, the long sweeps were stowed away, and the bare sides bristled with men. "They have not even hung out their shields," said Elof tauntingly. "They think us such easy meat." "Well, so much the better. They have been mistaken here." He heard something then, and Rock also. A distant drumming boom, borne to them down the wind. And as they drew closer still, they could make out the platform upon the wide bows of the warship, and the strange figures stepping up onto it, clad in spreading robes that swept this way and that, and some form of masked headdress. They looked at each other. "What in hell's black breasts is that?" growled Rock. "A shaman," said Elof, "to dance up their battlecraft and counter ours. Maybe they do fear us after all." Rock made no reply. They sat in breathless silence as the Equus craft knifed through the swell towards them, white foam spurting and spraying past the black prow, disdaining the ice floes with ruthless grace. The drum rolled and thudded down the bitter airs, but the sinister shape in the bows stood motionless, the mask drooping as if the head beneath was sunk in thought. Suddenly it lifted, and the drumbeat changed, stuttered like an excited heartbeat. From side to side the mask swayed, and the robes spread and billowed beneath. Faster and faster the shaman danced, leaping from one leg to another so the robes wove and wagged behind him like a tail, throwing back the long mask till the jaws dangled, shaking them in a sidelong snarl. They could see now that the robes were streaked in gray and white, the mask crested with low gray curls, and ending in a large black muzzle rimmed with gaping fangs and black gums. "Wolf," muttered Elof. "Ouchgas, the Wolf clan. I know the mask from Mylio's records, but we have faced few of that line in the Westlands." "Then make ready for a new treat," growled Rock. "Here they come." Caught in the inexorable play of waters and winds, the two craft charged down upon each other like great deer sparring in the forests of the Northlands. Elof gripped the tiller tight in his fist, counting the time against a quickening heartbeat, fighting off the urge to flinch, to swerve away. That would not save them now. The black boughs lifted over them like an axe over a twig, ready to ram. Rock shouted and ducked down. The sea fire bounced and heeled violently on the warcraft's bow wave, and Elof thrust hard on the tiller. A handspan only he moved it, sharp as a measure, but the cutter answered instantly as any living mount. Its bows swung, the sails pressed closer to the wind, and the little craft heeled sharply. Rock whooped in triumph as the black prow slid harmlessly alongside and past them, the painted beast face leering in baffled fury. From the awesome figure of the shaman came an ululating howl of rage, and longbows lifted over the rail above. But Rock, still on his knees, had already drawn bow, and the range was a few strides only. He loosed. There was a yell, and a black-garbed figure toppled between the two hulls, so close he almost struck the Seafire's deck. That held back the storm a heartbeat, when every instant was a gain, time enough for the hulls to draw a small way apart, and Elof to shift the rudder a fraction further. The little craft heeled further away from the Equest ship, even as the first ragged volley of arrows was launched. Meant to sweep its deck, they thudded instead into its upraised flank, or spat through the sails with little harm. Before the last had passed, Brock bobbed up from behind the rail and fired again. He hit nothing, but Elof fired across the stern transom and struck one of the yelling faces above the steering oar. More arrows hissed and rattled into the Seafire's timber. Then they were past and away.
"Harris, you timed that close,"
gasped Brock.
"But what now? They'll be about in a moment and snapping at our heels."
"Will they indeed?" asked Elof quietly. But even as he spoke, the black ship was sweeping around in a wide circle, its hands frantically paying out the sheets till the great yards swung almost parallel to the hull, and the black sail ballooned outward from it like a child's kite. With majestic ease, the warcraft leaned over and came gliding after the skipping cutter.
"At least we're almost past bowshot,"
began Rock, then ducked hastily as a flock of arrows sang close over the deck.
"That's not natural," he protested, "shooting against the wind at that."
His eyes lit on the shaman, still hopping and leaping at his post.
"It's that bastard," he cried, "guiding the arrows by his craft."
Something heavier crashed into the planking. Wide fletches of black and white stood quivering in the stern transom.
"And they've brought a catapult to bear."
He was about to spring up recklessly and shoot, but Elof pulled him down. "Wait," he commanded, flinching slightly as another catapult arrow riffled his hair with a ghostly breath. "Ready to trim sail. Now we may test them in their turn." With calculated suddenness, he bore down hard upon the tiller, and the cutter swung still closer to the wind, heeling so sharply now that, arrows or no, they both sprang out to the rail and leaned back to balance it. Behind them, the warcraft seemed to hesitate a moment, then slowly and ponderously eased itself onto the new heading. What happened then was startling in its suddenness. The taut black sail appeared to tremble. Then all in a moment it spilled, collapsed, and snapped taut again. The huge craft listed alarmingly. Then, with an explosive crack that carried even upwind, the strange sheets parted and the sail whipped free, streaming out like a bedsheet on a line. The black hull plunged and bucked, and the shaman, springing for the safety of the foredeck, was hurled out and away like a stone from a sling. His robes billowed out as he struck the water. They saw him struggle a moment, win free of the wolf mask, but become tangled in his soaked furs and borne down. Even amid the chaos of the warship's deck, a line was thrown to him. But in that chill water, it was already too late. He vanished in a swirl and rose no more. Only the gaping mask bobbed empty among the drift ice. Elof's laugh was a snarl. "You see, Rock? You see? Just as when I lost the wind, but worse with that clumsy rig. They can't shave the wind so close, and never dreamed we could. So they were all aback in an instant, their sail loose and flailing this way and that." Rock nodded grimly.
"And one shaman the less. They'll waste their arrows now, but they'll follow all the harder for that. And there's the others in their wake still."
Elof pressed his lips tight. He eased the rudder now, and the Seafire settled a little further from the wind, on the reaching course that was its fastest point of sailing. Then we'll see how they fare among the ice. The race begins. So began the maddest of mad dashes, a fearful plunge between floe and floating island, fleeing the servants of the ice upon the very winds it spawned. It took the ship of the Wolf Clan no more than 10 minutes to rein in its sail and start after the sea fire once more, and that was all the lead they had. Nor were the other ships so very far behind. For narrow channels and passages between and around the thronging slabs of ice Elof drove, ever seeking a place where the cutter could pass unscathed and a larger craft might not. But he soon found this was less easy than it seemed. For the wolf ship was like all Equesh ships of war, narrow and lean for its length, and its bows were well reinforced for ramming other ships. Also, it had many hands to fend off dangerous ice with the long sweeps. More than once Elof and Rock saw these bend and splinter against some immovable floe, or snag in a crevice and topple their wielder into that murderous ocean which sucked a man's life in seconds. But they were not discouraged. So hot now burned their thirst for vengeance. Through the fringes of the pack ice raced the sea fire, the cold sea hissing and slapping at its flanks, but the wolf ship still closed till once again they hung only just beyond bowshot, and the wildest chances Elof took could not dismay them. But all the while he was sending the little craft weaving and twisting between the floes, his thoughts were elsewhere. Even as he noted the huge ice island ahead, weather sculpted in the shape of some fantastic crooked claw, he was ranging through his wide memories for any scrap of knowledge that might serve them in their desperate need. It was almost summer now, for what that meant in these regions. It would not melt the ice islands, but at least the drift ice would stay free, and probably not close in around them. That was some comfort. What had he heard of ice islands so long ago in Assenby? That the greater part of them lay hidden beneath the water. But that was an old saw. There was something more, that even the seal fishers would steer clear of them, though mere collision could not harm their resilient skin boats. Why? He gritted his teeth and sent the sea fire gliding in towards the shining mass. Rock was dozing where he sat, exhausted, but the changed note of the water awoke him to see the mass of ice seemingly rush towards them. His bloodshot eyes bulged, but after one look at Elof, he sat tight and let him steer. Closer Elof took them, and closer still, till the crooked peak of the ice mass loomed over them like a gigantic image of the Equesh prow. He risked a swift glance astern and gestured to Rock. "Come, take the tiller."
Me? Here?
"Yes, just hold it as it is. Put it down a little when I give you the word. Hurry." Rock scrambled aft and seized the tiller, while Elof moved stiffly over to the rail and drew his sword. He weighed Gorthar in his hand a moment, and then as they swept under the crooked overhang, he seized a stay and swung himself up to balance on the rail, reaching up with one arm. Then he struck with all the strength he could muster, once, twice, again and again, and the ice clanged like metal. "Now!" he yelled, and Rock swung the bows away from the island. He turned back and gestured defiantly at the Equesh. A catapult arrow buzzed past his shoulder and shivered into the ice wall behind. A flight of darts followed it. Hastily, Elof ducked back, sheathing Gorthar and seizing the helm once more.
What was all that about?
Inquired Rock with sinister calm.
Aside from scaring me awake, that is.
"A guess," said Elof absently, looking quickly ahead and astern by turns, as if loath to lose sight of the Ekwesh, whatever the hazards ahead. "A throw of the dice, waiting them a little, perhaps. We'll see, any moment." The wolf ship was nearing the ice island now, and the sweeps were going out as before to fend it off. Riding higher in the water, it could not pass under the clawed peak as had the cutter, but swung as close as possible, and it was at the claw that the sweeps thrust. Fragments of ice broke away and fell, some into the water, some on the decks, but the black-clad warriors paid them little heed. Then there was a warning shout and scattering from the rail, as the whole tip of the peak cracked and dropped away where Gorthar had hewn it, but it fell well clear of the black hull. Rock swore.
It was a worthy try, though, that.
Elof shook his head sharply. Wait and see. There. He pointed, not at the ship, but at the island, and Rock gaped in horrified awe. The broken claw was swinging back, away from the warcraft, tipping back into the sea, and rising from below. For a moment, the warcraft seemed to float on green glass. Then the great mass burst through the surface into blazing whiteness, straight under the stern of the black ship. Those aboard it had no time to move, scarce enough to scream, ere the whole sleek craft was flung upward, tipped over with a crash, and sent sliding down the new summit of the island to nose downward in the foaming waters. It twisted there a moment, its shattered stern upthrust, while dark flecks flailed and struggled in the turmoil around it. Then, as the sea fire swept away down the channel, it fell slowly forward and was gone.
Glad I'm no enemy of yours,
said Rock darkly.
You planned that.
I hoped for it. Elof fought the tiller as the swirling water overtook the cutter and set it bobbing like an angler's float in the narrow way, struggling to keep the bows away from the floes on either hand. Gambled that their commander had never sailed around such islands. I've heard fishermen say they kept away from them because they were unstable. They melt, they weather, the balance changes, and the least breath turns them turtle. When I saw that odd outcrop, I thought we might speed matters along, and as well I did. See what comes? But Rock had no need of the warning. He also had seen the black sails of their other pursuers, billowing out like some vast bat above the floes, far closer than they had a right to be.
They've found some other channel,
spat Rock.
I am leading this way. Might even cross this one.
Elof nodded, but glanced up at the sails. It's a chance we'll have to take. We could go no faster among the drift, even if we dared. But it soon became plain that Rock was right. The southerly channel was drawing ever nearer their own. And ere long, the first of the Reaver's ships had caught up enough to see clearly. Once or twice an arrow arced up from the throng along its side, and twice they saw a catapult aimed and fired, but dart and bolt fell far short, into the sea or scuffing harmlessly along the ice. Rock shaded his eyes.
Don't see any shamans in those bows, do you?
They both grinned, as wolves may grin. But the two channels must meet right enough. Somewhere ahead there, remarked Elof. Not far. Then, shaman or no, we'll have them closer on our tail than the others, and forewarned. This channel's too easy for them.
So what can we do?
Turn away, down the channel if it goes on, or another. One that's harder, one that'll take us closer to the ice.
Fine choice,
Muttered Rock.
but so be it.
It was little more than 1,000 paces ahead that the two rough channels came together, in a mockery of a crossroads, and the new one did indeed weave gradually away to the northeast. Elof glanced at the dark ship, now running almost parallel with them, and with scarcely a touch on the helm, sent the Seafire gliding down the new channel, angling towards the high walls of the ice. To their pursuers, it must have looked like the last act of desperation, and Elof kept having to remind himself that it was not. There must, come a point when the unwieldy sailing of the black ships would tell against them, and the cutter could slip away. That was a reasonable enough hope, but it was also the only hope they had. All the remainder of that day the cutter sped northward, racing and weaving like a seabird over the white-strewn wet waters. The only seabird, for the skies were bare of life. Not so the sea. Once or twice upon flat-topped floes the voyagers saw dark smudges, as of ink on paper, that lifted round alert heads as they drew closer. And if they came too near, close enough to see the patterns on the sleek fur, the seals would cry out in gulping alarm and go humping and slithering off to plunge into the dark waters. Once, a bulky, bloated-looking monster half the length of the cutter only raised a majestic snout crowned with a crest that bobbed like an inflated bladder and bellowed a hoarse challenge to the intruders.
Not today, brother,
muttered Rock.
Save it for the Ekwesh.
And upon another floe they passed a heap of sprawling reddish shapes that were each of them larger and bulkier than that huge beast. And when they raised their heads, Rock cried out, for some were armed with immense protruding teeth.
Like dagger teeth,
cried Rock, and snatched up his bow. Leave them be, said Elof quickly. I've heard of them, called Walrus in the northern speech. They're harmless shell diggers, save when provoked. Anyway, you might make little impression on such beasts. Their hide is thick. It was valued for cables in Norderney. Within the shadow of the blue-white cliffs, though, even these signs of life vanished. Cruel and stern they gleamed. Mountain high they reared, or so it seemed, and as majestic in their power. Yet barer than the starkest stone were they, with no substance on them or around them that was not their own, no tree or plant, no soil, not even the rocky debris borne by glaciers of the land. Nothing save the snow which was their first and primal stage, and by whose accumulation alone they could grow. Here the ice contemplated only ice, and the water it hoped soon to freeze into itself. All else was intrusion, and by that they seemed somehow diminished in Elof's eyes. And he looked upon them with contempt and defiance in his heart, where there might else have been awe. Once only, when the cutter came to a clear patch where the sun struck down into the blue waters, they saw huge pale shapes like ice ghosts glide beneath them in the depths. Ere long they surfaced, not far off, with snorting spouts that clearly made them some white-skinned breed of porpoise or small whale. And suddenly they seemed heartening company in this cold waste. But they did not play like porpoises, and all at once they dived and were gone. They had seen the black shape that came sweeping up channel, heard perhaps the squeal of the catapult windlasses echoing through the hull. Elof ducked at the snapping ring and hiss of a shot, even though it splashed harmlessly astern, then turned to Rock in real alarm. How could we hear that at this distance? He glanced up at the streamers, the vane, and could see them begin to sag and falter.
The wind's dropping, howled Rock. Now, of all times, after it's come pouring down on us day in, day...
He looked suddenly at the cliffs and at Elof, and freckles blazed on his paling cheeks.
You don't reckon they...
Now of all times, echoed Elof, and our pursuers may use sweeps, and we not. Yes, they know someone is here, the masters of that wind. But they cannot stop it all in a minute, so let us get the best from what is left. He swung the tiller over, and the cutter went racing in even closer beneath the lowering cliffs. Into the very embrace of the ice, he said grimly. As they passed within the arms of a wide bay, Rock made no answer. He was staring up at the cliffs. From afar, they had seemed a solid wall of whiteness. This close, they looked ancient, crumbling. Their faces lit a ghastly blue, riven and shadowed with cracks and chasms through which white avalanches came tumbling and smoking to drop into the sea beneath. Such an aspect, noble yet blasted, might a lord of old have worn who had fallen from youth into a cruel and dissolute old age, and bore the marks of all he had wasted and corrupted. Against such a background, even the black ships in their wake seemed almost innocent, vessels of a merely human viciousness.
And they're falling behind at last by Karis's gate.
Rock slapped his fist into his palm. Aye, and are they? Said Elof between his teeth. With their rig and their weight, they need far more wind for steerage way. And within the shelter of the bay, there isn't enough. Whereas for us... Rock grinned back, tapped his nose in understanding, and glanced up at the wind vane. Then the grin was struck from his face, and he yelled hoarsely. Shadow fell across the cutter like a cloak, and all the sea about. Elof turned swiftly, and for a moment he could only cower. So vast and looming was the threat. It dashed thought from his mind, and for a moment he was an animal, or less. It seemed that the whole immense cliff was moving, tilting above the stern of the cutter, leaning forward to rush down upon these tiny creatures and scour them from sight. His wits returned to him, and he saw that it was only a part of the cliff, splitting along fissures that were already there, down which those avalanches had fallen. Yet that part was the size of a goodly hill, and though it leaned with the slowness of nightmare, it seemed already to fill the sky. Under the lowering shadow he saw only one faint hope of escape. Feeling as if his limbs were weighted with lead, he slammed the tiller hard over and sprang up, as though through thick oil, to seize the cold wind vane in both hands. Again, he sensed vast weight, and beyond it the presence of another will opposing hands, but momentarily relaxed, distracted. He thrust with all the force of his fear, and the vane swung round a good 2 points. Then abruptly it stuck. Elof's hand slithered over the pattern, and for a moment he thought he had fallen overboard. Green light billowed around him, clouded and chill. He could not breathe. He was sinking, twisting among silvery threads of dwindling air bubbles. And from the forest green depths below, something else was rising to meet him. Rock shouted and pulled him down, or he might have fallen indeed, as the sails snapped suddenly full and the sea fire heeled and bobbed around. Forward it surged on its new heading towards the far arm of the bay, racing the shadow of that toppling death across the ice-strewn waters. Elof, gasping with the reaction, glanced back once at the foremost warcraft, saw the sweeps arise along its sides and beat frantically at the water. But whether they sought to pursue or back off, he never saw, for at that moment the cliff face fell. From the glacier it broke with a crack like thunder and a great cloud of powder snow, one vast single slab. It did not slither like a landslide, but tilted forward like some petrified giant, to crash down face first and rigid across the black waters of the bay. With a booming explosion, the waters leaped skyward amid a spray of shattered ice, then fell back in a great arched wave that welled out with a devouring roar to fill the bay and rise in wrath against the very cliffs themselves, hammering upon the uncaring face of the glacier with the flows it had spawned. Had the dying wind not shifted, the sea fire could not have escaped annihilation beneath that titanic fall. As it was, it had hardly reached the arm of the bay when the mass struck, and barely escaped being tossed into the air on that first gigantic upsurge. But the failing breath of that breeze bore the little craft clear of the wall a moment before the vast wave struck it, and out into the ocean once more. After it, the wave came racing, a tide of thundering blackness, crested with teeth like white glass, but with its first energy spent, else the cutter might not have survived. As it was, Elof and Rock had time only to fix tiller and hatch and lash themselves in before the breaking waters crashed against their stern. For a time that seemed centuries, all was racing, rushing confusion, an endless torrent of ice-laden sea sweeping over them like the flow of every mountain foss in the world together. It was drowning and worse than drowning behind that curtain of rushing waters, for they were battered and bitten by the fragmented ice it bore, and the black chill of it made them gasp in agony for air they could not get. Ice boomed and crashed against the hull. The jagged rim of a floe swept by above their heads and plucked at the starboard mast stays like a finger at harp strings. Then it was past, and the cutter wallowing and twisting upon the lesser waves that followed, riding outwards like ripples in an infant's pond. Elof and Rock tore free their bonds and scrambled around as one to see what had happened behind them. The sheer force of it dazed them. The vast slab had split upon impact, and two huge ice islands slowly bobbed and spun in the bay, with a million lesser shards and fragments of ice around them. But beyond the mouth of the bay, a great fan of sea lay black and bare, scoured almost clear of ice by the passing of the wave.
"Yekwesh,"
croaked Rock, as the turmoil subsided. Elof spat out a mouthful of seawater and coughed violently before he could speak. Under the slab, dashed to nothing, as we would have been, but for the vein. Little their masters cared if only they could strike at us. He looked around suddenly. But the other two, were they?
"'Fraid not,"
said Rock unhappily, and pointed. Beyond the dark gap in the drift ice, dark masts lifted like leafless trees against the graying sky.
And they're not running, neither.
They'd time to see it coming, said Elof grimly. Lowered sails and rode it out with sweeps. And now they'll row for us. Fast. He looked despairingly up at the sails, but they hung soaked and limp in the sluggish air, gaff and boom swaying idly. Not so much as a breath. He stumbled wearily up, rubbing where the ropes had bruised him, and clambered unsteadily to the stern post. The vane still hung in its socket, but it too was swaying idly, and swung to the touch of his finger, one side to the other without the least resistance. Calm settled like smoked glass upon the windless sea. Rock's voice came to him distant, distorted, as through deep waters.
Can't it do something? See the speed of the bastards. They'll be upon us in minutes now.
Elof shook his head. Nothing. No wind to work upon. The virtue I set on it was to summon, to direct. But it can't summon what's not there anymore. In dazed despair, he hung on the vane, feeling the swirl of the pattern, the sense of drifting down into green depths and the vast black shadow shape below. Nearer, even nearer, the two faint gleams, dim points of light. He stiffened suddenly, gasping, clutching the vane in shaking hands as if he feared to release it.
Is it a wind?
Cried Rock, and then,
No, man, what are you about?
Elof heard him, but it was too late. He had wrenched the vane from its socket, held it a moment to his brow, then brandished it high over his head. Since the wind fails you, he breathed, show us what else your craft may command. And with a great effort, he hurled the precious thing from him, straight into the path of the oncoming ships. Far out over the waters it spun. Rock flinched, as if he half expected that calm surface to shatter like some vast dark mirror. But the black waters swallowed it with scarcely a ripple, and he cursed. Elof hardly noticed. His work was fixed still in his mind's eye, falling, sinking, drifting down into the green, cold depths, down to a rising shadow. The ripples faded. The mirror lay calm once more, open to the cutting onslaught of the black bows. For the pace of 2 slow breaths, it seemed that nothing would happen. Then, around the spot where the vane had vanished, a little spurt of bubbles pattered up. Elof swallowed, painfully, for his throat and mouth were suddenly very dry. Another breath, and Rock leaned forward suddenly, eyes narrowing in alarm. In the same spot, but with scarcely a ripple, something else broke the surface. Something small, rounded, and glistening that gleamed dark as the sea around it, and yet was no bubble. Slowly, steadily, it arose and grew to a tapering, pointed shape, and Elof was momentarily filled with disappointment. That sleek black head, as large, perhaps, as a horse's, must surely belong to one of the very large seals they had seen, curious at all the disturbances above. Then the head lifted, clouds of steam jetting from narrow nostrils. The eyes blinked open, and with a shudder of fascinated horror, Elof saw they were like no ordinary seals, set small on each side of the head. These were immense, with a green and cat-like glint in them, and they were set as forward as his own. This way and that they turned as the huge head swung, water streaming from a crest of coarse fur that ran like the mane of a horse down the narrow column of neck beneath. Still, it rose out of that eerie calm like some vision of nightmare, emerging from a mirror, higher and higher on a neck of impossible length. It seemed it would never stop, as if the legends were true that made it an endless serpent engirdling the earth. Yet it was no serpent. Beneath the water, a wide, whale-like body was becoming visible, and around it in shadowy outline 4 limbs like the flippers of a seal, and a long and tapering tail. When the rolling curve of the back at last broke surface, that head stood taller than the Seafire's mast, higher even than the mastheads of the Ekwesh warships it rose, swan-like and graceful, immensely majestic, infinitely terrible. Their rowing slowed, the long sweeps clashing in disorder as the rowers turned to stare at what they saw mirrored in the calm water. Then the sweeps dug hard into the water, their fierce onrush faltered. They glided to a halt and hung there, rocking gently.
"What is that?"
gasped Brock.
"Not
Elof clamped a hand over his mouth.
Not a sound,"
he hissed into his ear.
"Don't attract his attention."
Aye, the sea devourer it must be. Amakak himself. He sensed Rock stiffen, and felt little better himself, overshadowed by that long head, those enigmatic eyes. It was a sight to make the heart shrink, to bring home to him how different was the order of the ocean. A monster harboring monsters. A good 70 strides in length were those great warcraft, but the creature before them was at least as long, and many times outweighed them. It floated now between them and the cutter, motionless save for the briefest flick of limbs beneath the surface, and the watchful swing of the great head. Elof held his breath. He could not guess what it would do next, which way it would turn, but his foes, who had seen this creature summoned, could not know that. Yet they were not craven, the Ekwesh. Their codes demanded they avenge defeats and deaths. After that first breathless pause, a sudden defiant howl rang out. Upon the leading ship, a wolf-clad shaman sprang forward to prance and posture at this new apparition, while behind him came the bark of harsh commands, the creak of catapult winches, the rumble of feet upon the decks as the archers ran up to form battle ranks. The drums rolled, the oars swept down in a single surging thrust that sent the black ships lancing forward. The icy air seemed to crack like a whip, and volleys of arrows came sailing up from their decks like leaves in a sudden gust. Against ships or men that hail of shafts might have told terribly, but the devourer was greater than the greatest whale, and that massive back bore thick hide or even bony armor. What few arrows struck served only to sting and annoy him. His head tossed back, he gave a single barking snarl, and the long neck snaked down so swiftly that the arrows seemed slow in their flight. Against the length of him, his head seemed small, but it was 3 times longer than any great cat's, 4 times that of a wolf. Along the decks it raked with jaws agape, and strewed the helpless archers like chaff. 1, too slow or too bold to leap for his life, was seized and borne bodily into the air. Robes streamed and fluttered about those jaws. It was a chieftain or shaman who threshed in their grip. Catapult bolts sang up from the decks. They were harder to aim, but by skill or chance, one struck high on that narrow throat and sank deep into its iron muscles. The reeking jaws parted, their prey dropped to a crash unheeded upon the deck, and a whistling cry of pain split the air. Then it was as if the whole sea around the devourer boiled up, lashed into foam by limbs and tail as the vast beast gathered itself up and hurled itself forward, to strike like a true serpent at its tormentors. The vast flippers slammed down upon the decking before it, their blunt claws tearing at the planking, and then, amid a tumult of howls and screams, like a seal mounting an ice floe, the devourer hauled its great bulk bodily out of the sea and onto the deck. The mast was brushed aside like a twig. The timbers creaked and shivered, and beneath that vast weight, the whole great ship was flattened down into the water. Elof saw the terrified oarsmen springing from their benches, but the sea was already flooding across the high gunwales, and they were swept away in foaming turmoil, or plucked from handholds by the water that fountained up through the shattered deck as the hull timbers gave. The broken ship lurched, twisted, and canted over, and together with its destroyer, it sank from sight. The sea swirled in where it had been, setting the drift ice bobbing and spinning, and only a few scraps of wreckage spun above its grave. For long moments, nothing more happened, and Elof guessed that the destroyer had dived deep, as might a whale, seeking refuge in the depths from tormenting humans. The last warship, it seemed, had as urgent an aim. Its oars beat the water with frenzied strength, and the sleek craft came scything on across its fellow's tomb. Elof and Rock watched helplessly as the Ekwesh bore down on their cutter. Bent the man-eaters might be on escape, but they would not miss the chance to sink their prey first. Then a shadow passed once more over Elof's mind. Staring down into the black ocean, he saw what must happen, and could barely restrain himself from crying a warning to his enemy. So near and certain was their doom. Up from below surged that vast body, and the Ekwesh warship seemed to explode as if a volcano had erupted under its keel. They saw the hull shoot up under the impact and crash down upon its side in a wall of spray. And then all was hidden from them in roaring havoc. This way and that flew sweeps and timbers, and the helpless shapes of men amid a seething cauldron of sea, stirred up by limbs and flippers that lashed and pounded the black hull to fragments. Into the black ocean plummeted its crew like ants spilled from a nest, and like ants, the shrieking swimmers died beneath the crashing impact of those broad limbs, or were plucked up by the jaws that plunged and darted this way and that. Though perhaps the few who were left to kick and struggle a few seconds longer were the worse off, for the cold took them more slowly, and the waters swallowed them living and aware.
"We've got to get out of here,"
screamed Rock above the uproar, as the cutter lurched and heeled on the boiling sea.
"That brute'll have us next."
"There's still no wind," shouted Elof, fighting helplessly with the tiller and empty sails. "We're drifting, just drifting. There's not a thing more I can do." Suddenly, abruptly, the cutter lurched and lifted beneath him, and a hummock of black water swept by, almost gunwale high, a crestless wave that was the first outrush from that explosive emergence. It caught up the little craft like a hand and swept it forward, heeling and wallowing wildly. Elof had to wrestle with the tiller to keep it from capsizing. Other waves overtook them from that maelstrom of carnage astern, sweeping the floes before them and adding to their speed.
"We're heading towards the ice again,"
Rock growled. "Can't be helped," Elof answered, though he felt a sudden cold breath upon his neck. At least they were not headed back into that terrible bay, but around the arm of it, where the cliffs were less sheer and looming. Just so long as we get out of sight. The drift ice clustered more thickly here, but the waves they rode cleared it from their path and spent their energy in doing so. The cutter's speed dropped to a quiet glide, and they relaxed a little. Suddenly, the boom creaked and swung. The sail fluttered and cracked with falling ice. That breath played about Elof's head again. It was real, a movement in the still air. It even seemed to stir his hair a little, soaked and salt-stiffened as it was. He read the same pang of hope on Rock's face, and together they looked up at the streamers. They too were stirring slightly, even fluttering a little.
"A westerly,"
groaned Rock.
"Oh no, not here."
"Afraid so," sighed Elof, sagging wearily over the tiller rack. "We'll have to tack out of here. It'll take hours, and the sun's falling fast." Rock's cry alerted him. He whirled and forgot the wind. So appalled was he at the sight of that fierce silhouette, held high against the darkening clouds, surveying with regal calm the waste of waters around. Beneath it, no trace of turmoil remained, and on all that wide surface, no trace of the last of their pursuers. From that lofty vantage there was nothing here that could hide them, and a strange urge gripped him. He staggered to his feet in the stern, met that calm gaze with his own, striving to read what lay behind it, life or death, and felt the cool touch of awe and great wonder in his mind.
"That,"
breathed Rock, equally unnerved.
"What manner of beast is it? No sea snake, that's for sure."
"I cannot say," Elof whispered without turning. "Some cousin to the seals, I think. A giant among their kind."
"Where'd he come from? It was you, wasn't it? What'd you do?"
"That vein? In my lightness of heart I set its image upon that vein, not knowing what virtues of command it would bear. So when I turned the wind to my will, I summoned him also. All this while he must have been close to us, far below. A happy chance we did not use the vein more, or idly. Each time I sensed something, though I did not understand it till the last. Then I called upon it in desperation, not knowing what he would do. And still I do not."
"He made no move to attack anyone till those maniacs quilled him,"
Rock pointed out.
"That's something. He just sat there like he's doing now, as if he was waiting."
Then Elof gave a deep sigh, as of sudden understanding. He lowered his gaze and made as deep and courtly an obeisance as he knew how. And even as he looked up once more, the long neck drove forward among the drift ice, and as it swept forward it sank, slowly, smoothly, that proud head held level. The ice floes scattered before it like panicked sheep, and it trailed a wake of whiteness over the shadowed seas like a royal mantle. At last, only the head rose above the waters, and with startling suddenness, it ducked down and was gone. Elof turned away at last, on unsteady legs, to find Rock looking up at him, his broad face unreadable and pensive. "Well?" demanded Elof. "I suppose you'll think me mad to go bowing and scraping thus?" Rock considered a moment, gnawing idly at his lip.
"I didn't mind to do much the same thing myself, as it happens. If, that is, I didn't just kneel down and bang my head upon the decking. I'm not one to stand on my dignity, me."
Elof sighed and sat down heavily. "So you felt the same. I'm glad. That head, that face, as if... He never finished. A booming crash rocked the Seafire, and he was flung flat on the deck amidst a shower of ice from the sail. The timbers quivered as something jagged rasped along the keel like a giant saw. Then came another crashing impact that set the rigging thrumming. The mast stays sang like harp strings. Then where the floe had plucked at them, they frayed, snapped, and flew free. The gaff reeled and dropped down in a flurry of sailcloth. The mast tottered, sagged in its footing, and toppled. Elof could only clap his hands over his head and hope. He felt and heard the thudding fall, and the broken rail that pinioned his ankles, and the tangle of cordage and blocks that struck him painfully in the back, felt like the end of everything. But in the next breath he looked up, to find himself face to face with Rock, only a few inches away, peering out from under great swaths of gray sailcloth. In Rock's face he read the same realization, the same overwhelming horror and momentary panic. They spoke no word, but their thoughts ran in dark communion. Held in the thrall of the devourer, they had forgotten the other perils all around them. For that moment of forgetfulness, they might well be about to pay the price. At any instant, black water might come welling over those gunwales to stop their hearts in its chill embrace, as it had so many others this day. They scrambled to their feet, forgetting their pains, and stared anxiously about them. The deck felt strangely still and heavy underfoot, and across it lay the mast like a severed tree. The sails strewn beneath it, trailing half in the water. But that water was not black. Even in this failing light, it was the palest of blues, like a mockery of warmer climes. They stumbled to the side, stared down for a moment, and then they turned as one, still without speaking, to look across at the other side, and beyond, and up. They knew now why the deck was still. Wind and water and their own folly had conspired to drive them aground. But where there was no ground, they had come to rest upon the margins of the sea-born glaciers, upon the utmost shores of the ice.